Okay, good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. So today we're going to look at what monitoring multi-channel retail banking environments looks like. Pretty simple agenda for today's session. We're going to basically spend a little bit of time at the outset talking about why monitoring is harder than it used to be, and some of the changes both in the IT landscape as well as some changes in the way the business expects IT organizations to understand what's going on in the application environment. About a month ago now, we published a white paper on the 5 best practices for monitoring multi-channel banking environments. So I'll recap on those briefly, but then I'll actually show you how those best practices come to life or can be put into action using the INETCO Insight product. So we'll get into a bit of a product demonstration section. And then we'll have an open Q&A session at the end. You'll notice there is a chat facility in WebEx if you're having any technical issues or if you have any questions during the presentation. Please feel free to use that chat facility to send questions in. If it makes sense to address it as we're going along, we will. Otherwise, we'll queue the questions up and answer them at the end. And if you just want to sit back and listen and et cetera, then you can lob your questions in at the end. Final housekeeping note, the session is being recorded, and the slides will be available as well within a day or two after the presentation goes live. So if you do want to access the recording, that'll be sent out as well, or share it with anyone else in your organization. All right, with that in mind, let's get started. I think just to ground everyone, when we talk about multi-channel, we're talking obviously about any way of interacting with the bank, but often we're talking about self-service, and that's where a lot of the changes happen in terms of the way that banks interact with consumers. Some aspects of the in-branch experience remain fairly similar to what they were 20 or 30 years ago, although the architecture of a branch and the flow through a branch is very different. Self-service is where a lot of the innovation has happened in terms of adding new channels to the consumer experience. And if you go back to kind of the first phase of self-service, really the key to getting that self-service consumer, who I think most of us can agree is really the key target for a lot of banks these days, the key to getting that self-service consumer was the presence and location, having ATM machines in the right locations. And you could win that consumer by making your points of access essentially available to them where they needed them. Now, that started to transition as everyone kind of got to parity at that point. The next challenge was, okay, the self-service consumer doesn't want to just take out cash at the ATM. They want to be able to access a wider range of banking services. So they don't necessarily have to live by the hours of the branch, and they can do things like transfers and bill payments and mobile top-ups and even convert currency and do a lot more day-to-day banking at the ATM machine now that they're familiar with it. And so here, the bank that had the widest range of services available at the ATM point won that self-service consumer, was able to really convert that consumer maybe even from other institutions. And now as we look at an even more competitive banking environment where we're trying to figure out how do you get this new empowered mobile-based consumer, it really becomes about delivering the best consumer experience and doing that across the most touch points. Because now consumers are expecting to be able to interact through mobile devices, through their tablets. They continue to want to interact at the ATM, maybe at other self-service points, even within the branch location. And so the key here is being able to deliver integrated multi-channel capabilities and being able to deliver the best consumer experience across all those points. And that's really kind of the starting point for our conversation today. Now, all of this focus on multi-channel or on omni-channel, if you want to use some of the terminology that's out there now, means that obviously consumers want more digital interaction. And that creates a couple of interesting challenges for a lot of banks. Number one, you want to provide the most desired set of call them on-demand services, so that when that self-service consumer walks into a branch or approaches a point or uses a mobile app, they're able to access banking services in as many different ways as possible. And what we're seeing here is a growing number of cross-channel services where things like account origination could start in a number of different channels and may in fact even cross channels, where you could start an account origination process on your mobile device and start to become a customer of the bank, and maybe that involves a visit to the branch at the tail end to complete the documentation. Or staging a withdrawal at an ATM, where you're selecting your cash amount on a mobile device, and then you're approaching the ATM and just completing the portion of that transaction you can't do on your mobile, which is actually getting the physical cash. Mobile wallets are another good example of this, where not only are we thinking about it's not necessarily that we're thinking about every possible banking transaction available at every possible channel. We're thinking intelligently about how to offer certain capabilities and transactions, in many cases, that will span across channels. And another part of this is, as you're doing this, it's not just that there's more volume. In other words, there's more people interacting electronically. There's a multiplier effect here where making these type of transactions a reality means a lot more point-to-point transactions between different systems just to support a single consumer interaction. So you may have more people interacting with you electronically, but they're also creating many more transactions on the back end as multiple systems, and in fact often modern and legacy systems, are working together to deliver those new transaction sets. Now, most banks I talk with are very focused on staying ahead of the competition, both through their ability to deliver high-quality services, as well as their ability to deliver a diverse set of services and to ultimately execute on their brand promise. And all of that has an impact on the face that they want to present to the consumer in terms of their electronic transaction sets. And then finally, just to sort of recap the last two here, most banks want to better position for cross-sell and upsell opportunities. So not only do they want to be able to facilitate these new types of transactions that move across channels, but as that's happening, they want to spot consumers that may be good candidates for other services and other products based on how they're interacting with some of these new services and how they're moving themselves across channels, and be able to make the right offer at the right point. And this is becoming a much more sophisticated art that involves a lot more data than it used to in the past. And then finally, we need to make these investments in a sensible way. And so another key part of this is that as you're starting to invest in your channel environments and in integrating channels and delivering an omni-channel experience, one of the things to consider is, how do you reuse some of these software assets across channels? So how do you avoid reinventing the wheel in each channel? And this is harder than it may seem, because in many cases, banks have thought in terms of silos. And in fact, if you look at the way a lot of banks are organized, there are different silos for the ATM channel, for the branch channel, et cetera. And yet we've got these services that are starting to cross these channels. And there's a natural tendency to want to build the technology stack within each channel to serve what that channel needs to do. We need to now think about how you can create layers that will traverse across channels. And I'll come back to that theme later. So this is creating a lot of new pressures, as you can imagine. We've talked about some of these, where there's more diverse channels, there's more rollouts, there's more cross-channel service delivery, where we're activating components that move across channels. We're also integrating core systems and legacy systems with modern applications very frequently as part of this cycle. And often those systems behave and function in different levels. Some of us still don't have real-time core systems, whereas most of these modern apps, the idea is to provide a real-time experience. You have to provide an integration component between the two. There's obviously more consumer-facing technologies and applications out there, and all of this kind of comes together to create an environment of more operational risk. You've got more moving parts, more dependencies between those moving parts, and more ways for the consumer to access or poke their way into the banking environment and interact with it. And all of that really turns into a greater operational risk. Now, if you're looking at this from the IT standpoint, there's also a growing set of business expectations on IT, where the bottom line here really is the business expects this seamless operation across all these different channels. And yet, many of these channels were built on different technology stacks, by different people, and at different times, and often with very different requirements in place. You know, the applications that are used by the call center have very different expectations than the internet banking application. And perhaps your mobile applications have very different requirements than how your internet banking was built to begin with. And so there's a real challenge here in how do you maintain a consistent delivery experience across all these different channels that were built at different times by different people using different technology. And now you start to get into the core of the challenge for the IT department. Because the real challenge here is that the existing monitoring tools that most IT departments have in place are not enough to keep their teams efficient, but more importantly, not enough to keep consumers happy. Because what's happened is we've dramatically increased the complexity of both the applications and the transactions that they're able to execute. But the level of performance visibility that IT teams have across these channels has not grown at the same rate as the complexity of the applications and the transactions. So we've got this gap here, this visibility gap. And the result of that is a couple of things that aren't great. Number one, it's often consumers finding problems first. In fact, I've seen stats that suggest that up to 73% of the time, consumers are finding performance problems, or end users are finding performance problems before the IT department is aware of them. And the interesting thing is, we've been in this space for quite a few years. I have not seen that number move for the last 5 years at least, where it's still hovered in that 60 to 70% range. And in fact, it's growing. The other challenge is each of the teams here that are responsible for different applications or different channels are often very device-focused or component-focused instead of looking at the end-to-end transaction. They're concerned with the uptime and the availability of the ATM. They're concerned with the availability of the online banking channel, making sure that all the branch teller workstations are up and running. But they're very focused on the individual channel as well as focused on the kind of endpoint and uptime and availability as opposed to the transactions themselves. And what that means is it's not only how the teams are oriented, it's how their tools are built, it's how they see the world. And so they often have very fragmented performance data that when you want to look at a transaction or when you want to look at an interaction across channels, it's very fragmented. It takes a long time to correlate. And finally, there's also a lot of duplication of tools within silos where each of these silos has its own way to monitor uptime and availability and performance, and often the metrics that are captured are slightly different. The base for those metrics is different. And when we come back to our core theme of trying to leverage investments across channels, this is not happening typically in the monitoring world. So with that in mind, we've built a set of 5 best practices for how to monitor and understand a multi-channel environment. And no surprise, these have a lot to do with changing your focus to think more about transactions instead of thinking about devices. So it's a shift from uptime and availability as your key metrics to things like response times and usage patterns and failed transactions as your key metrics. And what I'm going to do here is actually show you some of these best practices in action in the Insight product so you can get a real feel for what this looks like. So we'll start with our first one, adopting real-time transaction monitoring across all your channels. So many of you may be doing some level of transaction monitoring, for instance, in your online banking channel, where you're looking at response times within that channel. But what if you were able to do that across all of your self-service channels, and even including extending it into the branch environment? So here I'm showing you a live INETCO Insight dashboard. You have to imagine there's a bit of a conglomerate behind the scenes here because we have across the top a number of different channels. There's ATM, there's self-checkout, there's lending, there's web store and online banking. We're going to focus most of our attention on ATM, lending, and online banking in today's example. But what this is doing is, as you can imagine, behind the scenes we have a whole bunch of sample data playing that is actual live, not live transactions, but real transactions that are executed in each of these channels. and we're monitoring in real time how each of these channels is performing. And one of the more interesting pieces here is in the middle here, looking at your response times for those different business units. And you might want to see, for instance, on an ongoing basis, how are all my key channels doing today? So let's just answer that question. We'll focus on the banking channels here. INETCO Insight can be used essentially for any monitoring any kind of application or transaction set, but here we'll focus our attention on financial ones. So here's my response time over the last 24 hours for my 3 core channels in this example: my online banking, my lending, and my ATM channel. And interestingly enough, you can see the response times are more variable and higher at the ATM side, which could either indicate that users are thinking a lot, or it could indicate that you've got some slow points in this cycle. Now, anytime you spot anything of interest, you can drill in and see exactly what's happening. But this is kind of that first best practice around being able to do real-time transaction monitoring across all your channels. So here I've done something that is probably pretty hard to do in your environment today. I've graphed the response time pattern of 3 of your core channels in one place within a couple of seconds. And I even have, back to this point, a live view of how that's doing. So this is this notion of both leveraging a technology investment across channels as well as getting a single point that provides visibility across these channels. Because what you're going to see happening is the operations teams that typically have been spread across these different channels are going to have to start to work together more closely as transactions shift from one channel to the other. You know, if all of a sudden you're offering the ability to stage a cash withdrawal at a mobile device, well, that's 2 different channels that are now involved in that transaction. If you still continue to monitor those independently, you're going to have a lot of challenges between those 2 teams as handoffs happen in the application, trying to figure out where problems may have occurred. Okay, on to our next best practice. This is the notion of using response times, usage patterns, and failed transactions as key metrics. So let me be clear. I'm not suggesting that you completely abandon your device or your component-centric monitoring approaches. Those are still very important aspects of maintaining the health of your IT environment. What I'm suggesting is that you begin to use another set of metrics to help you govern these new set of consumer interactions and understand how they're performing. And so here what we'll do is have a look at what a dashboard looks like for these kind of metrics. So here we're looking at our transaction rate overall for the system. That's important. You want to just know how many transactions you're doing, whether you're doing an unusual number of transactions, what that rate looks like by different channels. So here we're looking at ATM, online banking, and lending, and we're looking at the transaction rates. But it's the bottom graph that's actually more interesting and the ones we want to keep our eye on. What is my failure rate across all 3 channels? And you know, is it unusually high? And then secondly, let's look at each of these channels, ATM, online banking, and lending, and let's look at 2 other metrics. Let's look at my response time to see whether there's any patterns there, and let's look at the failed transaction rate to see whether I've got any issues there. And you can see lending applications an interesting example where you've got a pretty consistent pattern of failures in this application. And you can see the orange dots are also indicating where you've got unusually high peaks, essentially, in that data value. So what we're able to look at here in a single dashboard is, again, we're looking across channels, and we're looking at a few key metrics. We're looking at response times, we're looking at failure rates, and we're understanding the performance from the viewpoint of that end user or that consumer. Okay, the third best practice here is to choose a transaction monitoring solution that's scalable and configurable. Now, scalable is one thing. Scalable is really about the ability to handle the kind of volumes that you're going to be running in these types of environments. So you want a system that can handle hundreds or thousands of transactions per second and has the architecture to be able to do that so that it can scale up. And for those of you who are using some type of end user experience monitoring or in your online banking channel, for instance, many of those solutions are appliance-based. They tend to be very difficult to scale. They're sort of self-contained. When you start thinking about transaction monitoring as a cross-channel thing, you want to think about this more as a, how do I build an architecture to do this, as opposed to how do I go out and buy a single box that allows me to do it. That's one thing that's key about Insight is it's a software-based solution. So if you need to add additional horsepower to monitor more transactions, you're simply provisioning another server and putting software on it to do that. You're not trying to wire together a bunch of purpose-built hardware to do it. On the notion of configurability, though, a big part of this is you're putting in place a platform that is going to be used across channels by a variety of different people who may want to see the world in different ways. And so you want every aspect of the system to be configurable. So for instance, if you don't want to look at rate by channel here, well, you should be able to just change that and add different channels. Or maybe you're not interested in loans today, so let's take lending off of this mix. Or maybe I'm more interested in just the amount of time that the transaction's spending in the application. I don't care about the network time, so I could change that, for instance. Or I'm looking at concurrent transactions because I'm trying to study load patterns across the application. You should be able to get at that kind of data. And similarly, you should be able to create net new dashboards. So if there's different information you want to represent for different teams, each team should be able to have their own view of the world. And so that's another thing about how Insight's built. It's a highly configurable system, both in terms of the user's experience as well as the back-end experience. Because I'll show you another thing here where as you start to build out your world across channels and as you start to think about how these are implemented, the complexity starts to multiply very quickly, and you start to need a lot of configuration around, okay, these are my different ways of doing business, my channels. Those break into different applications. There's lots of different protocols and components used behind the scenes, and so it becomes really important when you start to think about what this environment looks like to be able to offer the kind of configurability that you need to be able to capture all the different pieces of it. So I've shown you a couple of views here just to give you an idea of both the complexity of the environment as well as what you need to be able to do to configure it. Next best practice is kind of the start early, start often one, which is you want to make sure you've got transaction monitoring in place before, during, and after new application rollouts. And those of you who are familiar with legacy transaction monitoring technologies where it used to kind of poke an agent or force code changes into your application are probably thinking, well, how is that even possible? If my application's changing, the last thing I want to do is try to keep re-instrumenting it with monitoring code. And one of the key things about a product like Insight is the ability to get that kind of visibility that you need without what I call forklift integration. So what INETCO Insight does is that it's a network-based solution. So it listens to the network traffic moving between the different components of your application and then provides full information on layer 2 through 7 on what's going on with your transaction. Now the nice thing about this is because it's only using data essentially off a span port or off multiple span ports on your routers, it can deploy in days. And it's resistant to changes. If you move application components around, you change the code in those components, it doesn't affect Insight. You're not re-instrumenting the code every time you're moving it around just to monitor it. Now that's a pretty big contrast to those of you who may have looked at transaction monitoring in the past, which has typically been pretty invasive. It's been application-based. You've had to put agents in each of the application components. You've had to plug those into a central analytics server. Often had to do a lot of customization to get the level of overhead and the level of detail captured balanced right so that your application doesn't suffer. And it often takes months to deploy. And there are often very low satisfaction levels here. Information Week reported that reported very high levels of dissatisfaction with the complexity of most APM solutions recently. I can't remember the data point offhand, but I think it was over 50% of companies that have chosen not to deploy APM or transaction monitoring have done so because it was too complex and they figured it would take too much staff time to keep it alive and ticking. Okay, and our final best practice is to use transaction analytics to track the performance of third-party service providers. Because one of the realities of the modern application environment is you're leaning heavily on third parties and outsourced applications in order to get yourself to market quickly. But where those used to maybe be, ancillary components of your application, they're now becoming core components. And so you want to keep your eye on things. And so what I'm going to show you here is an example of an alert that's fired, and the reason for that alert turns out to be a performance problem within a third-party environment. So within the banking environment, declines are something you want to watch. You expect them to happen for normal reasons, like someone puts in the wrong card number, they don't have enough money in their account. But then, as many of you know, banking systems are designed to recover very elegantly. So you can end up declining a transaction to a customer, but that can be because of an actual technical failure in the transaction flow, and you're just trying to make it look nice for them, essentially. So this event or this alert captures those types of things. And by the way, this is the primary way most of our customers interact with INETCO Insight. They set up a set of business rules, and then they sit back and let the system tell them when there's something they need to pay attention to. And those alerts often flow into their existing consoles, whether it be OpenView or Tivoli or SolarWinds or whatever you're using for your alerting console. So here you can see one transaction triggered this particular event. We can see how long that transaction took, how much time it spent on the network. We can see where it came from. Let's get into the next level of detail, though, here. Because this is not a simple transaction. This turns out to be a transaction in the ATM channel. We'll just zoom this in so you can see the whole thing. And it was a withdrawal, and the customer was trying to take out, looks like $420. It took 90 seconds for the transaction, and we've highlighted the first point in the transaction where the consumer got a message back indicating this decline. So here you can actually see this is what's printed out on the ATM screen. And it says issuer unavailable. Okay, well then let's kind of walk our way down this. Transaction was declined. Yep, declined. This part was normal. This part, the pre-authorization component was pretty normal. That's what's happened here, where we did a PIN check. That was fine. This request went in. Okay, that looks like it moved fine. But hang on a sec here. This request went out for authorization, and no response ever came back. That's why you see this dash here, where it was essentially an incomplete transaction from our perspective. So now what we've got here is an authorization request that went out to a third party, a key component of the application environment, and it looks like for some reason a response wasn't returned. Now your first question is often, well, was the network up? So you can just click this little button in Insight. This turns on all the background network traffic. You can see, oh, okay, yep, the network was up because I got an acknowledgement back. So that means that my request made it from my environment into that third-party environment. Their network basically sent me a delivery receipt saying, got it, and then their application never responded. So this is the type of detail. Now I'm showing you a very detailed screen here, but this is the type of information you need to be able to resolve disputes with third parties and to be able to effectively manage the performance of third parties that are part of your application environment. And that comes back to our fifth best practice, which is you don't want to just see what's happening within your own environment. You want to be able to see what's happening to transactions once they leave your environment. And of course, you can't always put a piece of software or a piece of monitoring software in that third-party environment. Sometimes you can. That's great. You can get more visibility. But often you can't. INETCO Insight provides a way using just the network data to monitor also what's happening in that third-party environment. Okay, so let's kind of, we've gone through 5 best practices here. let's sort of put this all together now and give you a view into what this all looks like. I kind of showed it to you in bits and pieces. Let's just close this down. So when you put this all together, what you can really do is you can see transaction flow across all your channels. You can drill down and see the performance of any individual channel. And you can start to understand those channels not just from the perspective of are they available, but how are they performing? What's the response time? Are there any transaction failures? And you can begin to understand them from that standpoint. And as you spot issues, and as your operations team spots issues, they can begin to drill into those issues, and they can see things like, is this an issue that's been happening consistently since yesterday, or are we just dealing with an intermittent thing that kind of happened and then went away? So you can begin to trend that information. One of the key points as you start to move into an omni-channel environment is you're going to be dealing with more issues that are going to cross silos. So it becomes really important to get that transaction view I was showing you where you can see the step-by-step progress of a transaction and see exactly where it slowed down or exactly where it failed, because at the end of the day, it's still going to be the support teams within those channels that are making the fixes. And so you need to be able to move these problems efficiently through the organization. You also want to be able to obviously not sit there staring at dashboards, but be able to act quickly when something happens. And so you want to be able to set up those business rules around how your environment behaves and then quickly act upon events or changes in that environment. So when you sort of put this all together, the idea here is being able to look across channels, be able to quickly identify performance issues, and then be able to rapidly isolate exactly where they're occurring so that you can restore your service levels as fast as possible. Now, you might be kind of thinking to yourself, okay, well, that looks pretty interesting. What's the business case for doing this? Well, it turns out the business case is pretty simple. First of all, almost 60% of IT organizations are not satisfied with the performance of their business-critical applications. Now, I don't know where you rank on this spectrum, but most customers I talk to would like more visibility than they have today, not less. But the business case becomes pretty straightforward. The average organization running a complex multi-tier application environment gets transaction completion rates between 71 and 90%. Now that's a cross-industry statistic. In financial services, we tend to be a little bit better. We build more resilient systems, so we're probably closer to that 90%. The average INETCO Insight customer gets completion rates of 97.5%. And that's a real data point that comes straight off of our customer environments and reports on their real transaction traffic. So they're completing a lot more transactions than the average organization. And in fact, we've seen customers we've been working with where their transaction failure rate has declined by up to 25, 26% in their first year of using INETCO Insight. So there's a very clear business case that comes from just completing more transactions. The second case is a lot of organizations using an infrastructure-centric approach to monitoring. It takes them about 2 hours to resolve issues. And again, this is based on survey data from an analyst firm we work with. Our customers tend to resolve problems 65 to 75% faster, which turns into a time of about 31 minutes or less. So there's a significant difference between the results you should expect monitoring your infrastructure only for uptime and availability, and the results you should expect by also monitoring transactions in terms of response time and performance. So there's a significant difference here. The numbers prove it out. And if you're trying to build a business case around this, this is just barely scratching the surface, but these are some of the experiences that we've had. Okay, with that in mind, we're going to do an open Q&A session now. So there are a few questions that came in through WebEx chat during the session, and I'll address those first. And if you have any questions now, please feel free to tap those in, and we'll answer them. Let me just find the first question here. Okay, the first question was, can you monitor Java and .NET applications? So this is a great question because I described the system as network-based. INETCO Insight can monitor the performance of an application regardless of how that application is built. So whether it's built in Java or .NET or Ruby, COBOL, you name it. Because we're monitoring how each component of that application interacts with the next component across the network, all we need to do is see what's moving across the network, and that could be written in any language. Now, if you're in application development, you're building a new application in Java, and you want to see exactly how your code logic is behaving, we're not going to be able to provide you that visibility. We're an operational solution. We're designed for operations teams that want to see how the whole system stitches together. If you want to see how the code is performing, there are deep dive tools that can do that very well, and you may, in fact, already own them. A couple of questions about different channels. One of them was around, can you monitor some sort of hybrid things like interactive ATMs, where there's a combination of an ATM-style device with ATM-style transactions, cash dispenses, etc., as well as kind of a connection back for a voice experience, where there may be a video or a voice teller in a call center that's assisting you with the transaction. The answer is yes. I mean, as long as the traffic from the application moves across the network, we can monitor it. INETCO Insight is very flexible and configurable to handle those types of environments. Next one was about monitoring a Citrix environment. So I know a number of you are using Citrix either to virtualize your desktops, virtualize potentially your ATM environments, or as a way to kind of take legacy applications forward into the modern world. In all of those cases, Citrix uses a very well-known protocol or set of protocols that can be monitored across the wire. So the answer is yes. Next question, how does this differ from an ATM monitoring or a switch monitoring system? So let me kind of take that in two parts. In terms of ATM monitoring to me is about understanding the health of the estate of ATMs and the health of that endpoint device. And so products like AfterVision, for instance, from NCR are really designed to give you a lot of detail and analytics on a fleet of ATM devices. They're high-value devices. They're expensive. You depend on them. You need that kind of level of visibility. And their primary focus is on the uptime and the availability of the ATM environment. What INETCO Insight adds is the ability to see what the consumer's experience is like at that device, to be able to look at the transactions once they leave that ATM. So let's assume the ATM, we know that the ATM's up and available. Now let's look at the transactions as they leave that ATM to make sure that all the transaction types the customer is trying to attempt are available and performing effectively. So that's the difference there. Switch monitoring, so here I think what's being referred to is some of the agent-based solutions that'll run on your base 24 or run on your Connex switch, and they'll kind of report on transactions as they enter and leave the switch. And I know a number of base 24 customers have that type of technology in place. Those are great at providing visibility into transactions at one particular point in your application. And if your entire application revolves around your switch, like a standard or a legacy ATM application, that's great. The problem is the way that we're seeing banks architectures unfold around omni-channel is the switch is becoming maybe a system of record in all of this, but it's often not the only place a transaction goes. So now just think about the ATM. You've got a server that may be doing the preferences for the ATM. You may have a separate path for check cashing. You may have another path for some of your mobile top-ups that doesn't go through the switch. And so all of a sudden, if you're looking at transactions only at that one point on the switch, you're missing more and more of the consumer interactions at the ATM. And kind of your visibility is going to decline with every new service that you add at that particular point. So switch monitoring is great for giving you visibility into things that touch your switch. The problem is fewer and fewer transactions as we go forward are going to make their way through a payment switch or end up as that as the only path. Okay, a couple more questions. I've got a bunch flowing in here. Do we monitor transactions other than payments transactions? Absolutely, yes. I didn't go into it in a lot of detail in the demo, but INETCO Insight can monitor any type of transaction. And in that demo I showed you there were database transactions, there were web transactions, middleware transactions, as well as financial transactions and payments transactions. So there's lots of different ways to, lots of different things that can be monitored here. This is all completely configurable. Okay, I know a number of you are probably already in virtual environments or private cloud environments, and there's a question around how we work in those type of environments. Pretty much exactly the same way, except that instead of capturing traffic off the physical network, we might be capturing it off of virtual network ports between your various servers. And there's lots of different ways to do that, and I won't get into the gory detail around it today, but it's absolutely feasible and possible, and we have customers doing it today. Okay, let me just have a quick scan over the question list here again and see if there's anything else that's come in. Oh, sorry, last question here was, I'd made a number of mentions of NCR throughout the presentation. INETCO is a close partner with NCR, and so the INETCO Insight solution has been integrated with the AptraVision solution so that you can get a seamless experience between the two, and some of those events and alerts I was showing you within INETCO Insight will flow into AptraVision so that you can use the incident management capabilities and all the automation capabilities within Vision to handle it. And obviously the NCR team is out there offering INETCO Insight as a product as well. So if you have relationships with NCR, that's a great way to begin to get introduced to the INETCO Insight product. And on that same sort of vein, we do offer proof of concepts of the Insight product. This is something a lot of customers take advantage of. There's nothing better than being able to see your own real transactions flowing through the system. That's typically a fairly simple process. You provision a little bit of hardware and connect it to your network, and we set up a proof of concept essentially, and that typically runs for about 2 weeks. Takes maybe about a week to get it going, and we give you 2 weeks to work your way through the software and work with you to maybe customize some of those business rules and get them right for you. But it's a fairly lightweight thing, and again, there's nothing that kind of builds the internal business case better than being able to show people what it looks like. Those trials are typically offered as part of the sales process if you choose, and I'll let you, your individual sales rep can help you figure out exactly what that process looks like. One of the other questions coming in was just what types of customers are using the software today. So INETCO Insight, what we have been showing today is our INETCO Insight 5 product, which has been available for about 9 months now. Prior to that, our Insight 4 product was very much designed for payments environments, and so we have a significant market share within the payment space. Customers like Jack Henry and FIS use the product in their production environments. The Insight 5 product broadens across protocols and channels, and we have a number of opportunities, including companies like Open Solutions that are using the product to monitor across multiple banking channels. And you'll see a number of case studies on our website. We've announced a few recently and that are joint wins with NCR, and you'll see those popping up shortly as well. Okay, that looks like that is the end of the questions. It's great, thank you. There was a lot of questions on this one. If you have other questions that weren't answered today, please feel free to email Stacy or and we'll get answers to those. And if you want a demo or want to learn more about the Insight solution, please do email us, and we'll make sure we get you in contact with someone that can get you started. And thank you very much for your time today. I appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed today's session. Thank you.